All right, well, we've got folks logging on, and so why don't we go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to Collegeville Connections, our new online events series presented by the Collegeville Institute, located on the campus of St. John's University in Minnesota. Collegeville Connections highlights the work of Collegeville Institute alums and friends from across the spectrum of Institute programs. And it provides an opportunity for new guests as well as program alumni and friends to stay connected with each other and to the Collegeville Institute. And so we're especially eager for you to hear today from two of our wonderful alumni and panelists. My name is Jessie Bazan. I'm the program associate for the Collegeville Institute Callings Initiatives. And before I introduce our guests, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Susan Sink, a staff member of the Collegeville Institute, who will let us know what we need to know about the tech side of things.
Hi, thank you for attending. I'm going to be behind the scenes, kind of running the various Q&A and answering people's housekeeping questions. So I just really have two things. First, we are recording live on Facebook. So if you lose your connection, you could go to the Collegeville Institute Facebook page where you should be able to see the stream. And also it will be available later as a link. We're going to use the Q&A feature, which you can access by just hovering over the bottom of the screen. When you type in a question, you can ask any question. If it's a kind of housekeeping question, I'll just go ahead and answer you directly. If not, we'll be holding the questions until the question and answer portion of the presentation. We ask that you don't use the chat feature, but just keep things to the Q&A. I will be posting a couple of links into chat so that you can see the various audiovisual resources that will be on your screen. And I think that's it. So thanks, Jessie, and thanks to our presenters.
Wonderful. Well, thanks, Susan. We are so pleased to have two of our friends from up north with us today. Reverend Rachel Twigg Boyce is vicar of St. Benedict's Table in Winnipeg, Manitoba, a church that's part of the Anglican tradition. St. Benedict's Table is one of 13 congregations participating in the Communities of Calling initiative, which is an ecumenical initiative that helps Christian congregations deepen their sense of calling. So Rachel is here today to talk about the creative ways that her congregation has explored their calling through weaving. And Rachel's joined by Carolyn Mount, who served as artist in residence at St. Ben's. Carolyn is also a former short-term resident scholar at the Institute who, if you've been in the Butler Center before, created those beautiful silk screen prints in the chapel area. So we're so pleased to have you both, and I'll turn it over to Rachel.
Thank you, Jessie and Susan and everyone else, and it's really good to be here and get this chance to share, so I appreciate the opportunity. So in the beginning of this year, it's kind of like an invitation into the way my mind works in some ways. But we began about 2 years ago as part of the Communities of Calling project that winter, going into both the season of Lent and also this project, knowing that we were going to have some opportunities to do some experiments and some explorations around vocation as a congregation, which meant we needed to come up with some ideas. So in the back of my mind, that whole winter was, what could we propose to do? Like, what would be a good experiment or a good way of exploring vocation as a congregation? In some ways, that was always rolling in the back of my mind. And then that year, as part of our Lenten series, we invited about 5 folks from our congregation to come one Wednesday each over Lent and tell us something about their own vocation story. And we wanted to keep it very broad in the sense of vocation is anything you do that makes your heart sing, that makes you feel valuable in the world, that is connected to how God wired you up, not strictly say priestly vocation or here's my paid employment. So we invited folks who were involved in a wide range of activities to come and talk about, why do you do that thing and why is it important to you? And one of the women who came, her name was Lois Ward, and she used a metaphor of weaving in her entire presentation, talking about the various threads of her life and how some had been dropped and some had been picked up over time. And in certain seasons of her life, certain things hadn't made any sense. But when she looked back over what God was weaving together, she could see patterns and she could see purpose looking back, where in the moment she wouldn't necessarily see those things. And sometimes things that had looked ugly at the time actually contributed to a beautiful pattern going forward. And she used all of this imagery, and it was a really evocative and beautiful presentation that she had done. And then at the same time, I was starting to scroll Carolyn's Instagram feed, and she was working in weaving and posting all kinds of different things from her loom and the like. And I highly recommend you all follow her on Instagram if you don't already, at Natural Born Weaver. So I was seeing her imagery. I was thinking about Lois's story, trying to also come up with what might we propose as some of our projects to the Institute. And then I took a trip to San Francisco. And one of the things I did when I was in San Francisco was I went to visit St. Gregory of Nyssa Church that had long been on my bucket list as a thing to do. And they had all of these really large standing looms that like a 2 or 3 or 4-year-old kid could use. And they had them around kind of the area where the kids would be during the service. And then they had also all these sort of smaller looms that you could see, they'd have a name and they'd be in a basket. So you could see that younger people were picking those up on a regular basis and weaving as in part of the service. And I had all of these things rolling around in my mind. And I thought, I think these threads might be coming together, but I'm not quite sure how yet. So I called Carolyn, who had been part of our congregation for a very long time. Full disclosure, Carolyn, I still consider you part of our congregation, but you had moved. Like, we're in Manitoba and you're now in Ontario. But I called you up and I kind of told you all of these things. And I said, does it make sense? Could we do some sort of corporate weaving project? Help me brainstorm, help me dream a little bit about this project. And we did just that. And we came up with an idea of doing a corporate weaving project. So throughout the year, the church would do more traditional teaching on vocation. There would be other things we would be doing through the project, but we would also very physically have, every Sunday when people came to church, a loom plunked at the back of the church that people could touch and people could use, and it would be a tangible physical reminder of all the other various things we were doing connected to vocation throughout the year. So the idea was to hold very loosely what we were in fact creating, what this thing would become, but to weave on a regular basis, to use the colors of the liturgical season. So in our context, when it was Advent, we would use blue. And we started this project a year ago in Advent. And we would have the color of the season, but anybody who wanted to could come and weave a couple of rows, and we would see what on earth it was we could create together. And there was some freedom to say, if we create a hot mess, that is a learning on vocation. If we make mistakes and they appear there as some sort of mistake, that is a learning on vocation. But how could we employ a physical, tangible, artistic piece into everything else we wanted to do connected to vocation in that year? And so we came up with an idea of how to make this happen. We would purchase a loom. We had some funding to do those things. Carolyn would be essentially our master weaver, the person who understood how this all worked, but working at a distance. And then we hired a woman from our church named Samantha Klassen, who works during the day and couldn't be here today, to be our on-the-ground artist in residence, spearheading the project. She could go to Carolyn with questions, like technical questions on weaving and all of that kind of stuff, but she would be the one setting up the loom, being there every week, inviting people to participate in this process. And so that is at least what we started to do. I'll say a little bit more about that later, but we kicked off that Advent season with no idea that a pandemic was coming, assuming we could all gather closely around a loom and touch things together for a full liturgical season and create a piece of weaving together. So that was the plan, and that is how we began. Also, as part of this whole process, we had Carolyn come in person one time and share more deeply about the technical craft or art, whatever you call it, Carolyn, of weaving, and some of the language and imagery that could help deepen our understanding of vocation. So Carolyn, I'll pass it over to you now, and you can share a little bit about that.
Thank you. Of course, my dog starts barking frenetically right at this moment. I am going to share a bit of a slideshow that just kind of shows all of you a bit of the weaving process, various aspects that I have done or projects I've worked on over the last couple of years. So as Rachel said, I was part of St. Ben's community for about 4 years. I was on staff. I was artist in residence for a year. During that time, I actually did do a month short-term residency at Collegeville when I was working kind of on an independent art project. But since then, I have moved to Northwestern Ontario. So I actually live on the border with Minnesota. I'm in Fort Francis. There's a river, and then Minnesota's on the other side. And my church community here is on that side. So haven't been able to be there for a year, but very close to Minnesota. So in terms of how I came to weaving, it was very unexpected. When I left Winnipeg, I had moved to Winnipeg initially to do my Master's of Fine Arts, and did that, was in Winnipeg for another year or two, and then had to move to Fort Francis because my partner got a job here. And at that time, I was kind of between art projects and wasn't quite sure what to do. Fort Francis is a very small community. There's not many like-minded people that I could kind of throw art ideas around and things like that. So I was kind of at a bit of a loss. And during that time, my father, he had tried experimenting with weaving after my mother passed away. He had been given a small tabletop loom and tried it out, and it wasn't really for him. So he then, when he was deciding what to do with it, I was like, I'll take it. But just to play around with, up until that time, I had zero interest in weaving. I had friends that had wove, and it did not appeal to me at all. Didn't really get it, but whatever, it's a free little loom. What can it hurt? Just at least gets my hands and my mind going. And then within a month, I bought my first floor loom, which is 80 years old and behind me, sight unseen off Kijiji. And it took 6 months to figure out how to ship it up here, but I was obviously hooked. And then more looms just kind of fell into my lap. And all of this kind of coincided with what Rachel was saying about what was going on in her life. For me, I went through a period of very debilitating migraines. I couldn't work for weeks and was actually off one of my jobs. It was not a healthy job. It was kind of a very challenging and stressful situation. And I ended up having these migraines that I think were really a result of stress and my body just knowing that was not where I was supposed to be. But as I was recovering, one of the few things that I could do was actually weave. I could not look at a screen at all. I could barely even go outside if it was too bright. I couldn't be in fluorescent lights. But sitting at my loom and making this connection between my hands and my eyes and my brain was actually very healing. It was, it's an analog process and there's nothing digital involved. And so my brain started kind of actually coming back to itself and healing. And at the same time, my body was like, just knew it couldn't go back to the job that it was doing. So in regards to my understanding of what vocation is or what that means to me, as much as it sounds cliche, I've always known that I was an artist, or I needed to be an artist. Even as a kid, I just needed to make. It has taken a lot of work and actually even therapy to kind of really own that and step into that and kind of go declare and believe with every part of my being that, yes, I am an artist. This is who I am and how I was made. But one verse or idea that has kind of helped me understand that is from Psalm 37, where it says, delight yourself in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart. And for me, it was never, God will just give you whatever you want. It was, he actually is the one that placed those desires there. He has knit us or woven us together. He knows every fiber of our being. Where else would those desires have come from? I am not a theologian. This may not be terribly theologically sound, but that's okay. It's worked for me, and I'm grateful for that. And so it's taken a lot to kind of step into that and live into that. And my understanding of vocation has changed and grown, and the work of being an artist has changed and grown. And like Rachel said at the beginning, vocation does not have to be this huge lightning bolt or this moment of where you feel called to this higher purpose of ministry or medicine, or it's not about a job, it's not about anything like that. It's about really coming into and owning who you are and what you're called to, and what, like Rachel said, what fires you up. But being faithful to vocation is not easy. It's easy in that if you are actually living the truth of what you are supposed to be doing, once you're actually doing it's easy, but it's actually having the confidence to do that. It may be letting go of beliefs of yourself or things that you've put in place to kind of protect yourself from having to be vulnerable and do those things that often have at least scared the heck out of me a whole lot. So vocation, the understanding of vocation can change your relationship, how you envision vocation, or at different times you may feel called to do or be true to something, and that may evolve. It may not be that you are going to do the same thing. I've had many different art practices and disciplines, but actually growing into how I'm called to be creative, that's the actual work. It's not necessarily the outward result or how that is demonstrated. So when I was moving here to Fort Francis and kind of at a bit of a loss, I was reading a book, When the Heart Waits, by Sue Monk Kidd. And it's about spiritual direction kind of and answering life's questions. And there's a quote in there that I really love. And she says, in a Hasidic tale, a rabbi named Zusa died and went to stand before the judgment seat of God. As he waited for God to appear, he grew nervous thinking about his life and how little he had done. He began to imagine that God was going to ask him, why weren't you Moses? Or why weren't you Solomon? Or why weren't you David? But when God appeared, the rabbi was surprised. God simply asked, why weren't you Zusa? And that just, it's like, you can't look and compare and analyze who's doing what and how they're doing it. Really, it is just about being true to who you are. And the other quote that I've come back to at so many different points in my life when I've been struggling with change or not knowing what to do or how to step into that vocation, it comes from Rainer Maria Rilke. And he says, I beg you to be patient towards all that is unresolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books that are written in a very foreign tongue. Do not now seek the answers, which cannot be given you because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the future. And again, it's just, it's really just about the process and being true to that process, whatever you're being called to, whatever that looks like. That's going to change. It may change and it's going to evolve, but it's being sitting with and being open to those questions and not knowing is, I think, most of the journey, which is not really an easy, nice, beautiful patent answer for what vocation is, but that's what it is for me. In regards to weaving, I'm just going to share a few reflections. I've shared in this slideshow a lot of photos, some of work I have done, some of the illustrations from hundreds of years ago. The technology has not really changed in a lot of ways. How the current manufacturing industry has changed dramatically in the last couple hundred years, but the the materials and the process has not changed a lot. So in regards to weaving, it is very slow. It is a super slow process. And that's kind of like life. As much as we think that life is really fast and going by, we have the same amount of time every day to work with. And when I am at the loom and I am weaving, it is line by line. It is literally, I take a piece of thread or yarn or string and I am making that into a three-dimensional object or form. And so you throw a shot of thread and then you change the treadles, which are the pattern, what determines the pattern, and you do it again. And it's just line by line. And it's kind of like minute by minute, hour by hour, we are building our life. And it's very slow. There's no kind of rushing through that. There's also this really, you are forced to be in the moment as you're weaving, as you're sitting at the loom. You really can only see what's right in front of you. So that image right there is actually, you can see as the cloth is made, it wraps around this front beam and then gets rolled on. So what's right in front of you is where the cloth goes from being an individual thread to becoming fabric. And then as that builds, you wind that forward. But all you're ever really seeing is 6 inches of kind of what is being made in that moment. And you can't rush that process. And then it moves forward and you kind of lose sight of that. And you can't really work 6 inches ahead of you because you're not there yet. You have to build that up. And so when you actually cut the cloth off the loom, that's what, like Lois was saying, you get this perspective of, oh, I forgot about, oh, I dropped some threads back there, or I made this mistake. And it is what it is, and it is now part of the cloth, and you just kind of have to live with it and accept it and hopefully even celebrate it. But there's this, you really just have to kind of be in the moment, and there's no kind of undoing what was done or moving forward. And like I said, you know, it is built line by line, and it's kind of like our days, and we all have the same structure that we're working within. What you do with it and what your skills and the materials that you're working with are very different than mine, but that's who you are and what you need to be doing. Patterns are kind of like recipes. We can all have the same recipe, but depending on what materials you choose, how you cut it up, how heavy you put spices in, whatever, we're all making it very different, but we're working with the same things. So again, it's not, you can't look at someone else and go, oh, they're being truer to their vocation, or they're doing something that I wish I should be doing. This is where you are, and this is what we're doing. So yeah, that, I think I'll stop there, and then Rachel's going to come back on and share a bit more, but hopefully the slideshow maybe at least contextualize a little bit of the weaving process.
Thanks, Carolyn. I'm on. Okay. So Advent 2019, we had done all this pre-work, all this pre-dreaming and imagining and getting the materials and the team together and the general idea. We bring the loom to church first week of Advent. We bless it. We encourage everyone to come participate. And then slowly, as Carolyn said, week by week, we began to weave lines in Advent of blue. And then the colors changed over the seasons. And almost instantly, Samantha, who definitely has the artist's mind, began to think like, well, what if we added patterns, or what more could we do, or how could we change this? So we continued to do that, but then she also started to create these very simple little looms out of cardboard, based kind of on what I'd seen when I was in San Francisco and told her about. And so some people of all ages were also able to pick one of these little mini cardboard looms up and go and sit and do that themselves during the service, because basically on the loom, you could only do that one person at a time. Many people could over a Sunday weave a few lines, but it's really a one at a time process. So then we would have folks in the middle of service doing these smaller weavings as well. And then she came up with ideas for how we could teach people patterns, and she kept kind of moving and innovating, and it was fantastic to be able to just sort of say, go for it, go for it. I don't understand what you're talking about, but it's great, go for it. And then in February, Carolyn, you came and you did your workshop and you shared some of the pieces that you've just shared with us today. And then there were more conversations around, like that sparked more conversations around vocation in the congregation, one of which encouraged a number of folks to read one of Kathleen Cahalan's books, which I'm going to come back to a little bit later when I show you some of the other things that were created over the year. And some of the ways she talked about vocation in her work began to become another language we would use. And you would find people very casually on a Sunday sort of saying, yes, the threads of my life, or I'm at loose ends, or like using this language. And sometimes it would be very, just very natural and unconscious. And sometimes they would do it and they'd be like, see, I'm getting it. I'm getting the weaving. And it became part of our shared language together as a congregation. And then in March, the pandemic hits. We are told we can't worship in person anymore. And I have to admit that the weaving project became very low on my priorities. I wasn't really thinking, but what about the weaving? I had like so many other things to think about. But not long into this process, Samantha contacted me and she's like, I've committed to this role and I'm getting a very small stipend and I have this sense of responsibility and what am I supposed to do? And I said to her, the bar is very low. Like, don't worry about it. If nothing happens, it's fine. If you want to do some weaving at home, I can arrange to get the loom to you from the church. But really, like, this is the least of your worries. Just survive the pandemic. It's fine. But with her serious commitment to the project and her innovator's heart, she started to come up with other things to do. So we began right away when we went into lockdown in March, we began doing 5 p.m. prayer every day on Facebook Live. We continue to do that now. If you ever want to join us, you're more than welcome. And she would join in, not every time, but with quite a bit of regularity. She would join in and she would say, if you put your prayer requests into the chat, I will weave a line in my home while we're praying together for every one of those prayer requests. So even though she became the sole weaver at that point, because obviously we couldn't be together to pass this around, people's prayers, like it's still a corporate project, their prayers were being woven into this piece. And then gradually, as some of our restrictions would open up, we're still not back to in person, but we were able to have her come into services and be like so far away from us, and the few of us doing the live stream and masked, and she would be at the back weaving while we were live streaming as well. And we would let folks know that this weaving was continuing. And then in addition to that, and just the general language and of it, and her showing photos of the work and people continuing to engage with the project, she created this brilliant comic book that I'm going to show you in a couple of minutes. And also a video of the next phase of the project. So once we got to the end of that liturgical year, like just before this Advent of 2020, she went in and recorded a video with some masked and distanced help of her taking what had been woven throughout the year off of the loom. So as Carolyn was saying, like while you're weaving, you only kind of see the little chunk that you're currently working on, and the stuff that you've already done gets rolled up in the loom and you don't see it for a while. So the whole year that she's creating, she has a sense, but she's not quite sure what's it going to look like when we pull it all out. How long is it going to be? All of those sorts of things. So we have a video of her reflecting on the process and also unweaving this piece. So Jessie, if you could pull up the comic book and then the video after. Both of these pieces, the comic book and the video, are available on our St. Benedict's website. I'm pretty sure they'll put there it is. The links are in the chat. Thank you if you want to go look, because you'll get a slightly higher quality resolution when you do it that way. So I'm going to pretend I'm Samantha, but this is her work here. So from the moment we're born to the last breath we take, our bodies are wrapped in some sort of fabric. Most of the fabric we encounter day to day is either knitted or woven. Knitted fabric is essentially made of interlocking loops of thread, and it's usually stretchy. Socks, t-shirts, and most sweaters are knitted. Things like jeans, tea towels, and flannel pajamas are made of woven fabric, which has two components. The warp is the long threads placed under tension on the y-axis of the loom, and the weft, the threads that get woven into the warp on the y-axis. Over and under, over and under, over and under. Weaving by hand can be a slow process, but it also can be very satisfying. It can help you move into that space where you're focused and attentive, where you feel that you, the loom, and the yarn are collaborating to make something worthwhile. And of course, like any manual task, weaving can also be frustrating and stressful. The yarn gets tangled. You realize you screwed up the pattern. You have to undo hours of work because of one mistake you didn't catch soon enough. And this is part of the reason weaving works so well as a metaphor for vocation. When we're thinking about vocation, we're looking for that sense of flow, that feeling we're doing what we're meant to be doing. And some of the time, though, maybe a lot of the time, it feels more like we're untangling a mangled skein of yarn than living the dream. But what if we're not as far from understanding our vocation as we sometimes think? What if all we need is a change of grammar? I want to point out here that if you've ever been to the Collegeville Institute, here Samantha is picking up on really common architectural patterns of St. John's, which I think is just brilliant. Kathleen A. Cahalan says we need to pay attention to the grammar we use to talk about vocation. We often think of vocation as a noun, she says. For example, I'm trying to figure out what my vocation is, or I'm searching for the meaning of my life. The danger is that when you speak of vocation as a noun, it can sound as if it is something already constructed. God will hand it to you ready-made, but life is rarely that neat and tidy. And I think that's a pretty great rendering of Kathleen. Speaking of your callings with nouns ends up sounding static, passive, and singular. One thing about weaving, it's impossible for it to be static, passive, or singular. The whole thing is a process that develops as you go. And there's no knowing at the outset exactly how it will turn out. One thread follows another and another. They build on each other, and no matter how disparate, they all become part of the same whole. And that's a bit like life. Looking back, we can often see the ways our experience crossed over each other to become part of the whole. We see how our vocation is composed of even the threads that, at the time, felt like a complete mistake or a shot in the dark. Because our vocation never was one static, solid thing. It was and is always in progress, always in action. For that reason, Cahalan suggests that instead of thinking of vocation as a noun, we can think of it as a verb. After all, vocation comes from the Latin vocare, which means to call. When we describe the action of our lives, we can begin to see callings are a response to God and others, says Cahalan. Vocation, in other words, is a kind of a conversation. It's a back and forth, not just a divine monologue. In a way, weaving is about a call and response to. Different types of yarn have different characteristics. They have different things to say. Some yarn is strong and some is not. Some yarn tends to get too tight along the edges, but when you try to correct it, it gets too loose. Weaving calls us to pay attention and respond to what the loom and yarn are saying. And this kind of attentiveness can help us learn to pay better attention to God's voice too. Simone Weil wrote, "Attention taken to its highest degree is the same thing as prayer." And if that's true, then practicing things that call us to attention, like weaving, can help us learn to pray. And prayer is perhaps one of our deepest vocations. So we've talked about the limitations of framing vocation as a noun and about how framing it as a verb can help us open up to an attentive posture of listening. But Cahalan wants us to go one step further to frame vocation in terms of prepositions. Now, what are those again? Prepositions are parts of speech that connect words to each other, to other words. I'm going to the market with Pat, away from the house for eggs. Prepositions express relationship. When we frame vocation through prepositions, callings become more relational, dynamic, and multiple. Each preposition reveals a different dimension of our calling. We are called by God, who is the source of our callings. We are called to follow the way shown by Jesus and taken up by his disciples. This calling we share with each other. We are called as unique persons with a particular history and circumstance. We are called from the losses and grief we suffer over time so that we can embrace life again. We are called to our lives for others, not simply for our fulfillment. We're called in our deepest suffering to carry out God's purposes in mysterious ways. We're called through the people in our lives because vocation takes root in community. And finally, we are called together to live within God's loving embrace, both now and in the life to come. So how do all these threads of weaving and vocation pull together? Maybe Cahalan's book title, The Stories We Live, is key. For Cahalan, there's no single or right way of speaking about our callings. Nouns, verbs, and prepositions are all necessary to storytelling. We find our callings within the stories of our lives, the story of God at work all around us. As for weaving, its story is our story. Just as the warp threads have to be set up at the beginning of the project and provide the through line of the piece, so do our lives have parameters we must work within and threads that carry us from beginning to end. And just like the weft threads can move through the warp in an infinite number of ways, so in our lives we can experiment with new colors, textures, and patterns, or carefully build on what has gone before, or find a way to do both at once. So as we move through our lives, day by day, thread by thread, may we find the tenacity to experiment with unfamiliar patterns, the serenity to trust the through line, and the courage to attend to the voices that call us deeper into God's story. Amen. Thank you. Jessie, if you want to put the video that people get to see Samantha and the project. Thanks.
Fabric and why I love weaving. Textiles surround us. They're everywhere. From the moment we're born to the last breath we take, we are literally wrapped in some sort of fabric, in contact with textiles. And when we wear these things, we don't experience it in the same way as when you're actually making it. And you can see individual threads that are coming together intentionally by your hand, where you are taking one-dimensional, two-dimensional thread and turning it into three-dimensional fabric and textiles. And then the magic is, you really, as you're weaving, you see a very small section of what you're working on. As the fabric goes from individual threads to actually woven material, it is wrapped around this beam at the front, and so you only see a small section. The hope is that when you come to the end of the warp and you take this off the loom, and you have 2 yards or 20 yards of this material that the community has made, that you can see how we all work together.
We started this project together as a symbol of our togetherness. We passed the yarn from person to person, our hands weaving row upon row, building on the loom together, just as we have built our collective life together. We took an analogy, the idea that our lives and our stories, our callings, are like a tapestry, and we brought the analogy to life. We embodied it. We acted it out. Sometimes when we bring an analogy to life, we call it a sacrament. Whether this weaving is a sacrament or not, it's something that we made together, and it holds part of our story. It tells us something about who we are. Or maybe more importantly, it helps us see that who we are is not something static or predetermined. We are becoming. We are being made. We search for our vocation, our calling, not as a way to nail down a divine plan that will exempt us from having to take risks, but as a way of choosing to show up and pay attention to the calls of one another, the calls of our own hearts, the calls of our neighbors, the calls of the earth. We will not find our vocation somehow prescribed to us, separate from our day-by-day journey. It is only in patiently following the story itself through time that the threads come together and reveal themselves. In a way, what we have woven is a calendar of colors marking those liturgical seasons that so shape and guide our collective life, and a calendar of a year fraught with so much disruption and uncertainty. And all of that is part of the story. Although the story may not have a discernible meaning to us, perhaps it has a call for us, somewhere, somehow. In spite of our separation and our isolation, we have been drawn together, and we are held together, just like the threads in this weaving.
So I will just jump in here. So just a couple thoughts kind of post that while we're still in a pandemic and how that relates to vocation. When we presented the unfurling to the community at the end of November before this most recent Advent, Rachel asked me to kind of share any further thoughts on vocation. And at that point, I was just thinking so much about how hard it must be for many people right now to feel like they are being able to be who they are called to be in the middle of a pandemic. I thankfully have been able to be set up to work from home, have all of the things that I need to do. For those people that their calling is service in some way or shape or form that is impacted or limited by the pandemic, or even not necessarily vocation, but if your identity is wrapped up in what you do and that has been interrupted by a pandemic, that's hard to kind of wrap your head around. And I think it's really just a matter of holding space for, okay, life is not what I expected right now. This is not what I envisioned. How can I still be true to who I am? What can I do? How can I think creatively? What can this opportunity teach me? I think for me, it's really important to remember that life rarely goes like we plan. We can all have our great idea of what the day's gonna go like, what the year's gonna go like, what my career is gonna look like. And life is the unexpected. Life is full of the interrupted and the things that blindside you that you have to learn how to deal with. And I think it's very rare that we actually look back and go, yep, that chapter is exactly like I planned it out. I implemented everything, the universe aligned, everything coordinated. It's all good, it's perfect. So yeah, we're in a middle of a pandemic. It is a hot mess. What we're given to work with is this tangled mess of expectations or disappointments. It's like this ball of yarn that is just one big mess, and you still have to work with it. We have to kind of take as much as we can at any given time and kind of work with that and unfold it and get the knots out, whatever it looks like. I think it's just being gentle with yourself that we are all doing our best. This is not what any one of us expected. How can we support each other? How can we encourage each other? How can we think differently about what vocation might look like? So that's just a little kind of small reflection on the pandemic and vocation. In terms of the final project, I have received the weaving. I have it here. It was hard to see in the video some of the details that Samantha went with the type of loom that the community was working with. It's really set up for the most basic weave structure, which is kind of plain weave. One thread goes over, the other goes under. And then Samantha, being Samantha, made as many choices and adapted as much as she could to change patterns, work with extra texture, really went far above and beyond. And again, these colors all coincide with the seasons of the liturgical year. And I have been given the honor of finishing this. So there's a lot that goes into weaving that is not ever seen or celebrated, and it is called finishing when you take something off the loom, because it's been held under tension, so you can have the firmness to work with in the weave structure. It needs to relax, it needs to chill. So it's kind of just hanging out here. The threads are kind of coming into themselves. The goal of the project was not ever about a finished product. It was not that we are making this for X, Y, or Z, or Z. It is really, the project was about calling, about vocation, about community, about learning together. So we, Rachel and I and Samantha, have a sense of what this is probably going to become as it is finished, but we're sitting with it, we're listening to it. When we know, I will start tucking in the tails. Every little thread that gets woven in needs to get tucked back in so it doesn't unravel. Washing it is called fulling, where it actually, the threads kind of fill up, and it instead of being really individual threads, they really enmesh and become a woven fabric. So there's that process, and then there's sewing and hemming and things like that. So the project is not done. It still exists. It is still growing. It's still teaching us. And there will be something that is finished that will be part of the St. Ben's community, that will be a visual, tangible evidence of this project. But really, that wasn't the goal. The goal was about learning, and I think we have done that and are still doing it. So that's all from me at this point. Rachel, is there anything else you want to add before we kind of open up for Q&A?
I'm interested to hear people's questions. I did want to mention the song that was in the video was also written by a member of our community. We have a bit of an embarrassment of riches when it comes to some of these things.
You truly do. Wow. Thank you for sharing the fruits of your prayer and your work with us. It's really inspiring, the work that you did. I invite folks to put any questions that you might have in the Q&A. We have about 10 minutes left. We just got one here. Jane asks, what are some of the interesting things you heard from members of the congregation when they were engaged in the weaving? And what are some of the interesting things you heard after the pandemic began and they were connected to the weaving through their prayers?
So one of my hopes with the weaving project, and I should say, I don't think the weaving would have been as effective way to explore vocation if it wasn't woven into other things like more traditional teaching, like chances to come and hear a seminar or do those kinds of things. But I was really hoping to help us develop a shared vocabulary, because in our earliest encounters with starting to talk about vocation in the church, what most often happened was we weren't using the word in the same way, and so we couldn't have a really effective conversation. So not that everybody had to embrace weaving as metaphor, but it was a way of starting to develop shared language. So hearing those pieces, like in the back of the foyer where people would start to say, like, I'm at loose ends, and start to be like having that shared language was one of those big things for me. A lot of things came up around art and perfection, and I'm really interested in the fact that we're doing the weaving, and I'm cheering you on, but I will not ruin the community project by also weaving. So there was some, if we could have done more if we'd had time, but there was some unpacking of like, everybody is valuable, everyone has something to contribute, and we promise you this is like very low bar art if you have like the way it was just the way we were helping people through. And then when it came to the prayers, you could tell that it was significant for people that a physical thing was being connected to the prayer. I know oftentimes when I don't know what to say to people, I'll say like, I'm lighting a candle for you. And on one level, it feels like such a nothing, but people are always really touched by that. So there was this, like, someone is going to physically hear your prayer, weave it into this art piece, and pray for you at the same time. It was really clear that had a connection to people. And I think then after this next step, when the project is in some fuller form of completion, it's going to be very interesting to see how people interact with it in the worship space, whether they've never seen it before and just hear the story, or they're like, oh yeah, I remember like that green, I remember weaving some of that, or that blue, I guess would have been the only color most of them got to weave. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. That's, I was curious, kind of along those lines, you both offered a really compelling witness for why using a metaphor and having a shared metaphor and project in a congregation can be so valuable and formative. And I'm wondering, we have a good number of congregational leaders who are watching this now. You know, if a congregation wanted to discern a metaphor that they could use, how would you suggest that they go about discerning what would work for them? What kind of a metaphor works for their particular community?
Well, I don't know if there's not like a recipe for that, but some of it was in that soup of me listening in the year prior. Like, I didn't ask Lois to present with weaving as a metaphor, and then Carolyn to start posting her weaving on Instagram, and then see a church doing weaving, but I was actively listening for what kind of project might be good. And these were some of the pieces that were coming. And then after, when I started to go, I think it might be weaving, having the conversation with Carolyn, and then our communities of calling team, and then, you know, gradually bigger circles of the congregation to kind of test out and say, like, is this landing with you? Because I honestly have about 10 ideas a day. They are not all good. They don't all land. So some part of it is that attentive listening to the people around you and what are you hearing? And then having maybe those smaller group of initial trusted people that you can like bounce that off. And my original weaving idea was not what we did. It was in the process of talking to Carolyn, who knows more about weaving than I do, and bouncing around what it could look like and how it could happen, so like my original idea became much better when I started to pull other people in. And I never imagined a comic book or a beautiful video or all the various things that Samantha was able to do as well. So it was bringing in the broader community as we worked on this.
I think one thing that I might add too is if there's a community that feels that they need to identify as a certain way, that actually starting to question that or unpack, they may already have a metaphor that they've been using and it's just kind of been assumed or they've taken it on, but not necessarily know why or what it's about or where the roots from that come. And even so, it's not necessarily even having to come up with a whole new metaphor, but just kind of reflecting on, okay, we seem to identify as this, or people recognize us as doing this. Why do we do that? What motivates us? What are we hoping to achieve? So I think there's two ways to kind of look at that. And I agree with Rachel that we have talked, like when we talked in February, when I did my talk almost a year ago to the community at a day retreat, and I asked at the end how many people have actually, touched the loom and wove, and out of 60 people there, maybe 5 or 6, and I was like, why? So like, why? What is the hesitation? And so it is very different than, I think, even if the pandemic had not happened and if this had happened been in the church for a whole year, it would look physically different because there would have been, Samantha's fingers are very much present in this because she had the time and the space and was dedicated into a way that other people couldn't be. But I think Rachel has reflected on how different this was received, and I think on paper it would have looked like it was not successful, because if she initially expected 50% of the community to at least touch it at some point and 5% did, on paper, does that make that a failure of a project? If we're looking at the end result, yes, but that wasn't what it was about. So again, it is kind of just opening up and kind of holding space for what we can learn from all of it.
Mhm.
Yeah, your adaptability in this and really paying attention and listening, like you're saying, to what's going on in the congregation and in the broader world seemed to really impact how you did this discernment, and ultimately kind of reflects the communal calling of your congregation.
Mhm.
So, well, gosh, this has just been wonderful. Thank you, Rachel and Carolyn, for your time. We've loved partnering with St. Benedict's Table over the years. We look forward to when we're able to all be together in person again soon. But really, thank you for sharing more about your project and your discernment and calling formation.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure both to be part of the initiative through Collegeville, which made all of this possible,
Yep.
and also to have moments like this to reflect and go, so what did we do? What did we learn? That helps deepen it as well. So thank you very much for that.
And this opportunity, doing this project, has reconnected me with a community that's now my community, but that is 4 hours, 5 hours away. But through technology, through the funding for the program, to be able to feel financially supported as an artist, as a part of the community, as someone, as something, one small thing to offer, has really been a blessing. So thank you to Collegeville for all that you guys do, and blessings on all the other projects that other people are working on, communities are working on.
Thank you. We're glad to be part of this. So, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. Please come back for more Collegeville Connections in the weeks ahead. Next Wednesday, we'll be exploring metaphors further. My colleague, Jane Patterson, who's the director of the Communities of Calling Initiative, and I will be talking more about metaphor as a tool for discernment. So today's presentation leads really nicely into next week. So we hope you'll join us. Thanks, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks. Bye.